Where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments because I want you to picture this. Your own street, your own city. But in the Middle Ages, no neon lights, no car engines, only the sound of boots on stone, whispers slipping through windows, and the heavy toll of church bells. Paris, October 13th, 1307. A night when one signal, one sealed order, turned the most feared brotherhood in Christendom into prisoners before dawn. It wasn't war, it wasn't chaos, it was silence. And silence is always the most terrifying sound in history. Tonight, we're stepping into that silence together. Paris, October 13th, 1307. The moon hung low over the Seine, its pale reflection broken by the slow drift of barges chained at their moorings. The city should have been alive, bakers kneading the first loaves of dawn, apprentices stumbling out with buckets of water, women gossiping at wells. But that night, Paris was under a strange hush. Soldiers were moving, but not in their usual patrols. They were shadows slipping through alleys, silent as wolves, their boots cushioned by damp earth and worn cobblestones. At the center of it all stood the great cathedral, its bells silent yet pregnant with menace. A single order, signed by King Philip IV and sealed with red wax, had already flown like poisoned arrows across France. Every bailiff, every sheriff, every commander of arms held the same letter. Strike at dawn. Arrest them all. Not one must escape. The Knights Templar, men sworn to Christ, armored in vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, slept soundly within their commanderies, unaware that their world was about to collapse. For 2 centuries they had carried the cross into battle, guarded the roads to Jerusalem, and built a network of fortresses that stretched from Portugal to the Holy Land. But what mattered most to Philip was not their piety, it was their wealth. Gold had poured into the Templars' treasuries, entrusted by kings, dukes, and merchants who believed no vault on earth safer than one sealed with the Red Cross. And now Philip, drowning in debts from his wars and greedy for coin that was not his, had decided the only way to balance his ledgers was to destroy the men who held the keys to Christendom's banks. Inside their main Parisian house, a stone fortress not far from the river, the Templars had prayed the night office. Candles burned low, dripping wax onto wooden floors worn smooth by years of kneeling. The air smelled of tallow, sweat, and damp stone. In the dormitories, brothers shifted in sleep, their swords resting near their pallets, though none expected to raise them against fellow Christians. They had enemies abroad, Saracens, Turks, bandits. But here, in the heart of France, they felt untouchable. The first knock came before dawn, heavy and deliberate. The porter stirred, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and shuffled toward the iron-bound door. "Who calls at this hour?" he asked through the slit. No answer, only the thud of fists again, louder this time. The porter frowned, lifted the bar, and in that instant, the world changed. The door burst inward, wood splintering against the stone wall. A wave of steel surged through the threshold, soldiers in the king's colors, their blades already drawn. The porter cried out, silenced by the flat of a sword that sent him crashing to the floor. Shouts rose through the corridors. Barefoot monks stumbled from their pallets, some clutching rosaries, others instinctively reaching for swords. But confusion reigned. These were not foreign raiders. These were the king's men. Their faces were grim, their orders clear. Seize, bind, drag away. Brother Gerard, a veteran of Acre, tried to resist. His arm caught a spear thrust. He collapsed with blood pooling beneath him. Another brother knelt, begging for an explanation, only to be kicked aside. Within an hour, the once orderly commandery was a prison. Outside, dawn broke over Paris, the sun catching on helmets and chains. Lines of Templars, bound hand and foot, were marched into the streets. Crowds gathered, whispering, some crossing themselves, others spitting. "Sorcerers," someone hissed. "Devil worshippers," another muttered. Rumors had moved faster than soldiers. The king's scribes had spread their poison well. The Templars had been accused of heresy, of blasphemy, of sins unspeakable even in the darkest corners of Paris. And yet, in the silence between the shouts, a different question lingered. How could men who once carried the banner of Christ into the East, who had fought and bled for the faith, suddenly become enemies of the very church they served? In the high towers of the palace, Philip smiled, his debts forgotten for a moment. Below, the Pope's messengers hurried with uneasy faces, and in the commanderies across France, doors crashed open, brothers were seized, and an empire of stone, gold, and prayer collapsed. Not with a battle, but with a whisper, a seal, and a king's hunger. Paris had awakened to whispers. By midday, word had spread across the markets. The temple had fallen. Merchants paused in the middle of weighing grain. Bakers left their ovens to cool. Women, clutching water jugs, asked one another in low voices, "Is it true? Did the king truly arrest the soldiers of Christ?" It seemed impossible. For nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar had been more than men. They were symbols, walking myths, wrapped in white mantles, marked with a red cross. Pilgrims in Jerusalem had knelt to kiss their hands. Kings had borrowed gold from their vaults. Popes had called them the right arm of Christendom. To see them chained like common thieves was like watching the cathedral itself crumble to dust. But to understand how a brotherhood so powerful could be broken in a single morning, you need to know what they had become. The order had been born in poverty. In 1119, a handful of knights swore an oath in the ruins of Jerusalem. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. At first, they had little more than patched cloaks and a promise to guard pilgrims who risked bandits, desert raiders, and the endless heat of the Holy Land. Yet poverty did not last. With papal blessing, the Templars were granted something far greater than land or treasure: immunity. They answered to no king, no bishop, only to the Pope. Donations poured in: estates in France, vineyards in Spain, castles on hilltops that watched entire valleys. Pilgrims left their farms to the order in exchange for prayers. Nobles joined the ranks and brought dowries of gold, armor, and horses. Within a century, the poor soldiers had become landlords, bankers, and generals. And here lay the danger. Kings borrow gold. Kings wage wars. But when kings must bow to men in white mantles for loans, resentment grows. In London, Paris, Aragon, Hungary, everywhere, monarchs whispered the same thought. What if the temple had grown too strong? Philip the Fair, King of France, did not whisper. He acted. By 1307, Philip's debts to the order were suffocating. Wars with England had drained his treasury. He had already taxed the Jews, expelled the Lombard bankers, and melted church silver. Still, the accounts bled red. And when he looked across the Seine at the Templar fortress, its stone walls thicker than his own palace, its vaults said to contain half the wealth of Europe, he saw not an ally, but a rival. That October night was not the beginning of Philip's anger. It was the conclusion. Years of schemes, accusations, and planted rumors had prepared the ground. He had whispered of heresies, that the knights spat on the cross, worshipped false idols, kissed one another in secret vows. None of it mattered whether it was true. It only mattered that people could believe it. So when his soldiers smashed the gates and dragged the knights away, Paris gasped, but did not rise. For a moment, everyone accepted what had once been unthinkable, and thus a brotherhood that had outlived crusades, sieges, and deserts was undone not by sword or spear, but by parchment, rumor, and the ambition of a single king. Imagine being a Templar in the hills of Burgundy or the streets of London that week. One morning, you pray in your chapel. The next, the sheriff is at your door with a royal decree. Some resisted, drawing swords, but most were stunned into silence. How do you fight the king's law when you had sworn your lives to protect Christendom itself? The Pope in Avignon, Clement III, was caught in a snare he had not woven. The Templars were supposed to be his warriors. By right, only he could command them. But Philip's soldiers had already filled the dungeons of Paris, and their confessions, wrung out under racks, brands, and boots, arrived faster than Clement could deny them. Heresy, idolatry, spitting on the cross, kissing one another's spines in initiation. Tales poured in. each darker than the last. You and I know what torture does. It does not produce truth, only words to make the pain stop. But to a frightened Christendom, those words were poison. The people were divided. In taverns, some muttered, "I never trusted them. Too rich, too proud." Others whispered, "If even holy knights can fall, what hope for the rest of us?" Mothers clutched their children closer when white mantles passed. Markets buzzed with rumors of hidden idols, secret rites, treasure fleets vanishing into the night. In reality, there were no fleets, no idols carved in horned shapes. What truly disappeared was far simpler and far more dangerous. Trust. Trust between crown and church, between soldiers and people. The temple had been a pillar of certainty, and now cracks ran across the whole foundation of Christendom. By the winter of 1307, bonfires burned in city squares, not yet for bodies, but for documents, cloaks, banners. Anything bearing the Red Cross was dragged out and thrown into flames. The smoke stung, acrid and sharp, as though an entire century of crusades was being erased in a single season. And still the question echoed from castle to cathedral. Why had Philip struck now, and struck so hard? Was it really heresy? Or was it gold? Behind the public trials, the king's accountants were already opening Templar coffers. Estates, once managed by knights, were signed over to the crown. The order's ledgers, meticulous records of loans, rents, tithes, vanished into royal archives, and yet some whispered that not all had been found, that under Paris, beneath the temple itself, vaults ran deep into the earth, and that when the soldiers broke in, they found only emptiness. The thought gnawed at Europe. Had the Templars hidden their greatest wealth before the dawn raids? Had wagons left the fortress under cover of night, rolling south toward the coast? Or had treasure ships truly sailed, not to the Holy Land, but to unknown shores? This was the beginning of the legend. For while Philip tightened the noose around their necks, the Templars' absence only magnified their mystery. Long before the prisons of Paris filled with chains, the Knights of the Temple had been nothing more than a handful of men. Imagine the year 1119, the dust of Jerusalem still unsettled after the Crusaders' conquest. Pilgrims poured into the Holy Land, driven by faith and hope, but the roads were cruel. Bandits haunted the hills, and more than one pilgrim's bones whitened under the sun before reaching the sepulchre of Christ. Into this chaos rode 9 knights, not princes, not bishops, not men of vast wealth, just warriors who had survived the wars of the cross, weary but bound by a vow. Their leader, Hugues de Payan, carried no crown, only conviction. They swore to live as monks, but fight as soldiers. Their mission was almost humble, to guard the road from Jaffa to Jerusalem, protecting the weak where no army would linger. The king of Jerusalem gave them quarters in a wing of the royal palace, built on the old temple of Solomon's Mount. That name clung to them like armor, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and the temple of Solomon. Poor indeed, so poor they begged alms for food, and legend says 2 knights shared 1 horse, but poverty carried its own kind of power. In an age when lords flaunted velvet and feasts, here were warriors in coarse tunics, sleeping on stone, eating from wooden bowls. Pilgrims whispered of their discipline. Priests spoke of their holiness. Soon, the stories reached beyond the city walls, carried across the sea. By 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the Templars received blessing from the Church. The seal of legitimacy burned into wax. They were now an official order. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most powerful voices of the age, praised them as knights without pride. His words rang like a bell through Europe, calling noble sons to trade silks for mail, banquets for prayer, pride for poverty. And yet, poverty did not last, because when pilgrims trust you with their lives, they soon trust you with their gold. Knights who once walked the roads with swords now held the keys to strongboxes. A pilgrim could deposit wealth in Paris and receive it back in Acre. The Templars had invented what was, in truth, the first great international bank. Within decades, their estates stretched from Scotland to Cyprus. Vineyards, farms, castles, mills, their banner, white with the red cross, flew over ships, towns, and fortresses. Their name stirred both awe and unease, for though they vowed to own nothing as individuals, as a brotherhood they owned almost everything. And here lies the paradox that would one day undo them. An order founded in poverty became synonymous with wealth. A brotherhood born in humility became whispered of as arrogant. The poor Knights of Christ had become treasurers of kings, but for now in these early years they were celebrated. Ballads praised their victories. Kings trusted them as advisors. Popes granted them freedom from local bishops, answerable only to Rome. They were no longer 9 men on a dusty road. They were an institution, one that would shape Europe itself. And yet, if you lean close to these pages of history, you can already hear the faintest crack in the stone. Because every rise carries the seed of a fall. Their wealth was not meant for feasts or jeweled crowns. It was meant for war. The Templars were not cloistered monks scribbling in manuscripts. They were cavalry, heavy, relentless, trained to strike with precision. Picture the hills of Outremer, where dust rises like smoke, and the sound of hooves is the drumbeat of destiny. A line of white mantles with crimson crosses charges, lances lowered, and the earth itself trembles. Chroniclers of the Crusades wrote of their ferocity. At Montgazard, barely 500 knights rode with young King Baldwin against Saladin's vast army. The odds were absurd, yet the Templars struck with a force that scattered troops 10 times their number. Some called it divine providence, others simply discipline honed to a blade's edge. To European knights who dreamed of glory, joining the temple was like entering legend. Once admitted, a man surrendered everything. His lands, his inheritance, even his name was drowned in the chant of brotherhood. He ate in silence, slept in barracks, and rode wherever the master commanded. No wife, no children, only the sword, the cross, and the endless march. But battlefields were cruel tutors. For every triumph, there were disasters etched into memory. Hattin, 1187, the day the kingdom of Jerusalem bled itself dry. Surrounded, parched under a sun like molten iron, the Crusader army withered before Saladin. Nearly every knight of the temple was slain or captured. Those who fell into Saladin's hands met execution, their white mantles stained forever red. Still, the Templar reputation did not falter. If anything, their losses only deepened the aura of martyrdom. Chroniclers began to speak of them as almost supernatural, men who fought with the certainty of death, unflinching. Pilgrims believed God himself armored their souls. Enemies believed they were possessed by zeal too strong for fear. Yet reputation is a double-edged blade. To their allies, they were protectors, guardians of the cross. To their rivals, even fellow crusaders, they were arrogant, inflexible, a power unto themselves. Kings resented their independence. Bishops grumbled at their exemption from local authority, and whispers spread that the Templars bowed to no one but the Pope, and perhaps not even him. As the Crusades dragged on, fortunes shifted, cities taken, then lost. Fortresses razed from stone, then ground to rubble, and at every turn, the temple poured men and treasure into the fight, sustaining the fragile Crusader states on a crumbling foundation. By the early 13th century, they were no longer merely Knights of Jerusalem. They were the vault of Christendom. They guarded relics, castles, borders, and the purses of kings. Their network of estates funded wars across continents. Even monarchs found themselves indebted to the Red Cross. And here again, the paradox deepened. The more they sacrificed on the frontier, the more suspicion they gathered at home. For in Europe, away from the desert and the blood, all that most people saw of the Templars was their stone preceptories, their immense lands, their mysterious rituals behind closed doors. It is in this tension, admired abroad, envied at home, that the seeds of their ruin grew thick. Because envy, once it finds a crown to wear, becomes a weapon sharper than any Saracen blade. The tide of history has no mercy. By the dawn of the 13th century, the kingdom of Jerusalem had become a memory, not a realm. The holy city itself, once wrested from Muslim hands, was lost again. Castles that had cost fortunes to build, Crac des Chevaliers, Chateau Pèlerin, the fortress of Saft, were besieged, battered, and sometimes abandoned, their stones left to bleach in the sun. For the Knights Templar, every defeat tightened the noose. They were sworn never to retreat, never to surrender. Yet they could not fight the shifting tides of politics in Europe, nor the swelling power of Mamluks in Egypt. At La Forbie in 1244, an entire generation of knights was cut down in a single catastrophic battle. The survivors limped back to Acre, the last coastal jewel of Christendom, a city clinging desperately to the sea. Acre was more than a port. It was a world in miniature. Merchants from Venice and Genoa jostled in its markets. Priests and pilgrims mingled with mercenaries and thieves, and towering over it all, the Templar fortress, a stone leviathan, its walls thicker than most castles, its treasury overflowing with gold and silver brought from every corner of Europe. But even within Acre's walls, there was unease. The Templars had grown powerful beyond measure. They lent money to kings and princes, secured fleets, brokered alliances. To many crusaders, they seemed less like monks and more like kings in their own right. Their rigid discipline, their secretive rituals, their refusal to bow to local bishops, all of it fed the whisper that they had forgotten humility. When Acre finally fell in 1291, it was not just a city that crumbled into the sea. It was the last stronghold of the Crusader states. The Templars fought to the last man at the sea walls, their banners torn, their swords shattering under the press of Mamluk steel. Chroniclers say the surf ran red that night, and the screams carried far into the waves. Those who survived fled to Cyprus. From there, they looked back at a land now lost forever. No Jerusalem, no Acre, no fortresses to defend, only islands, exile, and questions. And here lay the true turning point. Without holy war to justify their existence, without castles to defend, the Templars stood exposed. What were they now, if not monks with swords and coffers? Kings still owed them debts. Merchants still entrusted them with fortunes. But their sacred mission, to defend the Holy Land, was gone. And when a sacred mission dies, suspicion fills the void. Europe began to murmur, had the temple grown too rich, too proud? Were their rituals truly prayers or something darker whispered in vaulted halls by torchlight? By the end of the 13th century, the image of the Templars had shifted. Once saviors of pilgrims, now shadows with gold. Once martyrs in battle, now creditors knocking on the doors of kings. And there was one king in particular who listened to those whispers very carefully. A king who owed them more than he could repay. A king whose envy sharpened into a blade that would, in time, fall directly upon their necks. Have you ever heard the name Philip the Fair? Sounds charming, right? Handsome, noble, just. But don't be fooled by the title. Philip IV of France was not some fairy tale prince. He was more like a block of polished marble, beautiful on the surface but cold, hard and unyielding underneath. People who met him said his eyes were gray like steel, and when he stared at you, it felt like he was weighing your very soul. He rarely raised his voice, rarely showed anger, but that silence was worse, because everyone understood. One wrong move, and you'd lose everything. Now Philip had a problem. Being a king is expensive. Wars to fund, palaces to maintain, luxuries to flaunt. And by his time, the French treasury was nearly empty. He needed money, a lot of money. And unfortunately for them, the Knights Templar had plenty of it. The Templars, you see, weren't just holy warriors. They were Europe's first real bankers. They safeguarded treasure, loaned to kings, and owned land across the continent. To a man like Philip, they were less an order of knights and more a vault he couldn't crack, unless he decided to smash it open entirely, and that's exactly what he set out to do. But you can't just say, "I want their gold." No, you need a story, one so terrifying that people will believe you. So Philip began planting seeds of rumor, that the Templars were not holy at all, but heretics. That in their secret rituals they spat on the cross, kissed strange idols, even worshipped a demon with the head of a goat, the kind of accusations that sound outrageous, but stick in the mind like a thorn. Picture Paris in October 1307. The city wakes to the sound of boots and the glare of torches. Soldiers fan out across the streets. Hundreds of Templars, men once celebrated as God's chosen knights, are dragged from their houses, shackled like criminals, all on the same day, Friday the 13th. That single moment carved superstition into Western memory forever. But arrest wasn't enough. Philip wanted confessions, and to get them, he turned to torture. The rack, the fire, the rope, tools designed not to uncover truth, but to break the body until the tongue said whatever the king wished. And here's the darkest part. People believed it. They heard the forced confessions and thought, well, it must be true, otherwise why would they admit it? Fear is a faster messenger than truth. And Philip knew how to weaponize fear better than anyone. So, when you hear someone talk about the unlucky curse of Friday the 13th, remember, it began here, with a king who wanted gold and an order of knights who vanished under chains and screams. Some of the men captured that morning had ridden in crusades. Some had spent decades guarding pilgrims, living under vows of poverty and brotherhood. And now, they were thrown into dungeons so dark you couldn't tell night from day, chained in positions that tore at their muscles until they begged to die. One by one they broke, not because they were guilty, but because every man has a limit. Under the crushing pain of the rack, under the fire licking at their feet, the words Philip wanted spilled out. Yes, we denied Christ. Yes, we worshipped idols. Yes, we are guilty. But think about it for a second. If you had knives pressed under your fingernails, if your limbs were pulled until joints cracked, what would you say? You'd say anything. That's the horror of it. Truth becomes impossible to separate from lies when survival is at stake. Meanwhile, Philip spread these confessions like wildfire. Pamphlets, whispers in taverns, sermons from pulpits. Soon the Templars weren't remembered as protectors of pilgrims, but as servants of Satan. People spat at the sight of their cross. Families turned their backs on them. And Philip? He began seizing their property. Castles, manors, treasures, all quietly redirected to the crown. The same knights who once held Europe's gold now became a purse for the king's wars and debts. But there was still one problem. The Templars' Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. Imagine a man in his 60s, white-bearded, who had led the order for decades. He refused to play Philip's game. Torture scarred him, yes, but he would not confess to lies. His stubbornness made him dangerous, because as long as he lived, the idea of the Templars lived too. So Philip staged a show. In 1314, in Paris, a stage was built near the Seine. De Molay and other leaders of the order were brought out, chained but unbroken, to confess before the crowd. And here, in front of thousands, something unexpected happened. Instead of repeating the confessions Philip forced from him, de Molay raised his head and said, "We are innocent. The order is pure. We die unjustly." It was like thunder. Philip's careful plan cracked open in public, but the king couldn't allow that defiance to stand. Within hours, fires were built. De Molay was tied to the stake, flames climbing around him as he shouted his final words, calling on God to judge both Pope Clement and King Philip before the year was done. And here's where history leans into legend. Because according to chroniclers, both Clement and Philip were dead within the year. Poison, sickness, curses, no one agrees. But many whispered that the last Grand Master had pulled the Templars' revenge straight from the fire. So if you've ever wondered why secret societies, hidden treasures, and dark curses cling so tightly to the story of the Templars, it all begins with that night, with fire on the banks of the Seine, and the voice of a dying knight cursing a king. If you've ever watched someone pull a rug very slowly from under a table, just enough to loosen the plates without shattering them, you already understand how King Philip IV moved against the Knights Templar. There was no grand speech, No trumpet. Only parchment, whispers, and timing sharp enough to cut glass. Picture the royal accounting room in Paris, tapestries drawn tight against the draft, a charcoal brazier low and red, ledgers opened like wounds. Advisors bend over columns of numbers that refuse to behave. War is expensive. Palaces eat coin. Prestige demands spectacle. And the king, Philip the Fair, marble cold, studies the page the way a surgeon studies a tumor. He doesn't shout. He doesn't need to. He simply taps a knuckle against the figure that matters most, the crown's debt to the temple. Now, if you were Philip, what would you see when you looked across the Seine toward the Templar precinct? Not monks with good intentions, not heroes of dusty crusades. You'd see a fortress safer than your own vaults. You'd see a network that moves money from London to Acre faster than a royal courier can ride from Paris to Chartres. You'd see a rival center of gravity inside your kingdom. And rivals, in the 14th century, don't get managed. They get removed. But you can't just rob a holy order in broad daylight. You need a story people can swallow without choking. So, the work begins in the dark. Courtiers circulate concerns. Priests are encouraged to ask quiet questions. Old resentments are stirred like sediment in the Seine. The Templars, so austere they share beds and barracks, so disciplined they eat in silence, are recast as men with secrets no clean soul should keep. Did you hear about the initiation oath? The whisper goes. About the cross they spit upon? About the idol with the bearded face? You don't have to believe it. You only have to hear it often enough that your doubt grows legs. If you've ever seen how rumor works in a small town, you know the pattern. One clerk repeats it to a notary to a canon to a bishop over wine. Each retelling picks up a new thorn. By the time it reaches a noble household, the tale wears a velvet cloak. I was told by someone close to the court. And rumor dressed in velvet moves faster than any truth in sandals. Meanwhile, Philip's legal machine sharpens its quills. Indictments are drafted in tidy Latin. Charges are ranked from shocking to unforgivable. Heresy, always a crowd pleaser, goes near the top. Sodomy and blasphemy follow. If you wonder why such charges recur in medieval politics, it's because they require almost no evidence and produce maximum disgust. The brilliance, if we can use that word for something so cold, lies not in originality but in orchestration. Dozens of sealed orders are prepared, all timed to open on the same morning, across France, before dawn, before anyone can send a warning. But even a king's plan needs a fig leaf from Rome. The Templars don't answer to Philip. On paper, they answer only to the Pope. So messengers begin the long ride to Avignon, where Pope Clement XIV sits in a borrowed city, nursing a weak stomach and a strong sense of caution. Letters arrive with the chill of steel in them. Holy Father, grave news about the temple. Out of loyalty, I inform you first. The tone is pious. The content is a knife. Clement stalls. He sends back polite requests for inquiry, commissions, more testimony. It's the kind of delay that sounds like prudence from the pulpit and feels like surrender in practice. And every week he hesitates. Philip's story spreads. You know this dynamic from our own time. The first headline writes the script. The retraction, when it comes, whispers to an empty room. Inside the Templar precincts, life moves as it always has. Brothers rise before dawn, chant the offices, break their fast on bread that tastes faintly of smoke and salt. They drill in the yard, oil leather, check the tally of rents from distant estates. They do not feel the net closing because their world is made of habit and stone, and habit is a poor early warning system. Besides, who would dare? A king might grumble, a bishop might envy, but to strike the temple itself? That would be like striking the cathedral, unthinkable, which is to say, almost ready to happen. Philip also works the softer levers of opinion. He reminds barons of Templar arrogance at past councils, bishops of stubborn exemptions that bled diocesan authority, merchants of loans called in at inconvenient times. Everyone has a story, small, petty, human, that becomes, with a nudge, part of a larger indictment. If you've ever watched a coalition form around grievance, you can feel the temperature rise here. Not everyone needs to hate the temple. They only need to dislike it for different reasons. Add the king's prestige and the church's silence, and dislike hardens into permission. There is one more element: fear. Not the fear of the Templars, but the fear of what happens if you defend them and the king's tale turns out to be true, or if it doesn't, and the king doesn't care. Magistrates, sheriffs, captains of guard, they are not villains out of a morality play. They are men with families, incomes, ambitions. When royal orders come sealed and specific, the safest interpretation is obedience. History isn't always a struggle of heroes and demons. Often, it's a long hallway of people who don't want to be the nail that the hammer finds. By late summer of 1307, everything is in place. The indictments sleep in wax. The informants have their lists. The jailers oil their locks. If you were to stand on the Pont au Change at dusk and look back at the Templar walls, you wouldn't see a conspiracy. You'd see swifts looping above the rooftops, barges edging past, a boy kicking a reed ball along the stones. Conspiracies don't look like anything until they're finished. And still, the temple prays. The brothers keep the rule, read the psalms, tend the accounts. They know kings and they know storms. They do not know how to read the weather of a whisper campaign. Even if a rumor reaches a senior officer, the court is restless. Take care. What does taking care mean? Move the gold? To where? Warn other preceptories? On what charge? Besides, the idea that a Christian king would attack soldiers of Christ without papal process is not just unreasonable. It's a category error. It does not fit their map of the world. That map is about to be folded and burned. On the last nights before the arrests, Philip sleeps well. He has done the arithmetic. What he cannot capture, he will seize in reputation. Even if the gold has gone to ground, and there are already murmurs that wagons left the Paris house after midnight 2 weeks ago, he will still acquire the only treasure monarchs truly covet, the story that justifies their power. And the story, as he has arranged it, is tight. Heretics punished, order restored, a king defending the faith. Who argues with that without falling under suspicion himself? I want you to hold in your mind 2 rooms: the royal accounting chamber with its ledgers and lamplight, and the Templar refectory with its wooden bowls and silence. Between them runs a city's worth of alleys, a river, a hierarchy of offices, a chain of permissions and fears. The net is not a rope. It's 1,000 threads you don't notice until you can't move. When the bells finally toll before dawn on Friday, October 13th, they will sound like any other bells calling the faithful to prayer. But listen closely, and you'll hear what they truly are. The quiet click of a trap closing. The day that would stain calendars forever began without spectacle. A gray Paris dawn, damp air drifting off the Seine, the usual clatter of carts in the streets before sunrise. Bakers kneaded dough, fishmongers hauled in eels, priests lit candles for matins. Nothing in the rhythm of the city betrayed that anything unusual was about to happen. But in the shadows, the king's sealed orders cracked open like eggshells. Each captain, each bailiff, each sergeant of arms had been given the same parchment, the same precise command. At dawn, seize all members of the temple within your jurisdiction. Secure their persons, their houses, their treasures. Resist, not delay, for the safety of the faith and the crown. In Paris, the commander of the king's men stood before the great doors of the Templar precinct. His breath smoked in the cold. Behind him, a file of soldiers waited in silence, boots dark with wet. The captain raised a hand, and the bell that tolled for prayer was drowned by fists hammering on wood. Inside, the Templars stirred from their refectory. Some thought it was a messenger. Others thought perhaps a fire had broken out in the merchant quarter. By the time they reached the courtyard, steel had already flooded in. Crossbows leveled, torches flared, Latin accusations rang out. Brothers in white mantles, barely awake, found themselves shackled by neighbors who had once cheered their processions. This was no raid in a single city. It was synchronized. In Tours, in Poitiers, in Bordeaux, the same spectacle played out. Sealed parchments revealed, doors broken, knights taken in their cloaks, some still muttering psalms. The machinery of monarchy moved with ruthless efficiency, and by the end of the morning, hundreds of Templars were in irons. And here's where the cruelty shines. The charges were not read like sober accusations. They were performed like theater. Heresy, idolatry, sodomy, black masses, spitting on the cross, worshipping a goat-headed idol. Priests intoned them as if they were already proven, planting images in the minds of all who overheard. The Templars' silence, whether from shock, dignity, or refusal, only made the words seem heavier. If you were an ordinary Parisian that morning, peering out from your shutters, what would you see? Soldiers dragging out men you once called holy, a captain reciting accusations with fire in his voice, brothers pale, unarmed, taken like criminals. You would not see their ledgers, their donations, their discipline. You would see guilt framed in the very act of arrest. And most people, then as now, prefer to believe the spectacle rather than the quiet protest. The first interrogations were brutal in their speed. Shackled knights were hauled into chambers where royal scribes sat ready, quills hovering over parchment. Torture racks, iron boots, and ropes already waited. A question was posed, an accusation repeated, and when silence met it, the screws tightened, the rope bit, the body arched in agony. The words came eventually, not truth, but syllables of pain made legible. Yes, we denied Christ. Yes, we worshipped an idol. Not because it was true, but because no lungs can endure a strappado forever. And once a confession was inked, it became contagious. One knight's forced admission was used as leverage against the next. Your brother already spoke. Will you contradict him? Will you call him liar? The trap was as much psychological as physical. The order's unity was fractured not by swords, but by signatures. Meanwhile, Philip wasted no time. By noon that same day, heralds spread the news through Paris. The temple was guilty of monstrous crimes. Citizens were told their king had saved the faith from corruption. Priests thundered from pulpits that heretics had been unmasked in their midst. The narrative hardened before the accused could even catch breath. But pause here. Imagine yourself a Templar sergeant, 40 years old, scarred from battles in Acre, who had seen friends die for the cross. You joined a holy brotherhood, swore poverty, chastity, obedience, and now, in the heart of Christendom, you're accused of spitting on Christ, of obscene rites in the dark. What burns more, the iron on your flesh or the slander on your soul? And imagine, too, the chill in the streets that night, when ordinary Parisians whispered about the idols said to be hidden in the temple vaults. Some swore they saw wagons rolling out before dawn, covered with tarps. Gold, relics, bones. No one knew. But every rumor fed the king's victory. For in conspiracy, as in war, the first hours decide the rest. By the end of October 13, 1307, the Templars were no longer guardians of the Holy Land. They were prisoners, heretics, traitors in the public imagination. And Friday the 13th, until then just another date on the calendar, was branded forever with the memory of betrayal. News traveled faster than armies. Within days of the arrests in France, word carried along trade roads, whispered in monasteries, and bled into courtly gossip across Europe. The effect was like throwing a boulder into a still pond. The ripples spread outward in rings, disturbing waters far beyond Paris. In Avignon, Pope Clement V sat at the center of a web he did not spin. The Pope had been Philip's candidate, elevated after a contested election, and though he wore the tiara, he knew the French king's hand pressed against the back of his neck. Reports flooded in. The temple was accused of heresy, sodomy, blasphemy, worship of a horned idol. Clement's advisors urged caution, but the king's messengers demanded alignment, reminding the pontiff that to defend heretics was to share their taint. Clement hesitated. He issued bulls of inquiry, demanded formal depositions, and tried to slow the king's furious momentum. But hesitation itself became dangerous. To delay was to seem complicit. To question was to seem sympathetic, and Philip, master of appearances, framed himself as the savior of Christendom. Who would dare oppose the one who claimed to cleanse the temple? In England, the reaction was different. King Edward II, young and indulgent, could hardly imagine his Templar bankers and landholders as heretics. For years, the temple had financed his father's wars, built roads, even housed the royal treasure. Yet when Philip's letters arrived, stamped with the royal seal and echoing papal tones, Edward's resolve faltered. By January 1308, English sheriffs were ordered to arrest Templars, though with less fury, more hesitation. In some towns, knights were quietly summoned rather than dragged away. In others, they simply vanished, slipping into cloisters, disguising themselves, or fleeing across the channel before the writs arrived. Germany, Spain, Portugal, the responses were uneven. Some rulers obeyed, others delayed, others laughed at the charges. In Aragon, the king scoffed. "My Templars fought Moors in my fields. I never saw them worship a goat." In Portugal, the order would simply be renamed, reborn as the Order of Christ, cloaked in new colors but carrying the same swords. The crown needed their ships too much to let Philip's accusations destroy them. But in France, the heart of the storm, the arrests hardened into trials, interrogators multiplied, monks were brought in to read the confessions, solemnly, as if they were scripture. The public was told again and again that guilt had been proven by the brothers' own mouths. Few cared that those mouths spoke under torture. Few dared to ask why so many confessions sounded eerily alike, as if dictated. And then came the whispers that would outlive the arrests themselves. The treasure. Merchants swore that wagons rolled out of the temple precinct the night before the king's men entered. Covered carts, heavy with chests, escorted by a handful of brothers who were never seen again. Some said they sailed down the Seine to the sea. Others claimed they turned south, toward the Pyrenees. A few insisted they carried relics, not gold. The Grail, the Ark, the head of John the Baptist. The rumors multiplied like fish in water, each impossible to disprove. The truth may be simpler. Perhaps the treasure was seized in Paris, its coins melted into the king's coffers, its jewels adorning French crowns. Perhaps there was no secret caravan at all. But in conspiracy, absence is always presence. Every empty vault becomes proof of hidden wealth. Every missing knight becomes a custodian of myth. Meanwhile, in monasteries across Europe, chroniclers scratched ink into parchment, recording the spectacle as fact. To later generations, these accounts would read like verdicts. The temple was corrupt, therefore it was destroyed. But if you listen carefully between the lines, you hear the strain of disbelief. One monk wrote of his confusion, "How can those who bled for Christ be found guilty of hating him?" Another noted, "The accusations are monstrous, yet their punishments are swift. Where is the patience of justice?" And in villages, among peasants who once lined the roads to cheer the Templars' processions, doubt began to erode faith. If the holy warriors could be heretics, who could be trusted? If the temple itself could fall, what fortress stood secure? By the winter of 1307, the order that had guarded the pilgrim roads for 2 centuries was broken in the land of its birth. Its leaders rotted in cells, its houses stood silent, its symbols burned in sermons. Yet even as the king triumphed, the legend took root. For suppression rarely kills what it seeks to erase. It buries it, and from the burial grows myth. And that myth, whispered in taverns and cloisters, was already beginning to twist into something larger. The idea that the temple had not died, only gone underground. Do you want me to move next into Chapter 5? The Trial of Shadows, where we step inside the interrogation chambers and hear what the confessions sounded like and what secrets may have slipped through despite the torture. The hall smelled of damp stone and old sweat. Torches guttered in iron sconces, smoke creeping upward into the vaulted ribs above. A line of men in chains shuffled forward, once knights of the temple, now shorn, beaten, their white mantles stripped, replaced by coarse wool. The contrast was deliberate. Where once they had stood as guardians of Christendom, they were paraded like criminals before the court of shadows. The papal inquisitors sat high on wooden chairs, quills poised, scribes ready to record. They did not ask questions in the tone of curiosity, but in the manner of accusation. Did you spit upon the cross? Did you deny Christ? Did you worship the head of an idol? Each demand was spoken as if the answer had already been decided. At first, silence. The knights clutched their lips tight, eyes darting toward one another, as though to draw strength from the gaze of their brothers. But silence has no endurance against iron. In the dungeons beneath Paris, devices waited, racks to stretch bone from socket, boots to crush shins, cords to twist arms until they snapped. Some resisted. Men of iron will, forged in holy war, endured pain without confession. But many others broke, and when one voice cried out, the inquisitors leapt, scribes scratching furiously. "He has confessed! He has admitted to the heresy!" Soon others followed, words spilling out in fragments, in sobs. They confessed to spitting on the cross, to obscene kisses, to strange rituals whispered in candlelight. They swore they had been forced on initiation to deny Christ so they might learn courage. They spoke of idols. Some said a bearded head, others a black cat, others a jar containing the ashes of saints. Yet the confessions contradicted one another even as they overlapped. One said the idol stood in Paris. Another swore it was in Poitiers. One claimed the ritual was done once. Another insisted it was repeated every Good Friday. To any fair judge, the contradictions would have shattered the case. But the inquisitors did not care for truth. They cared for words that confirmed the king's accusations. Meanwhile, Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, remained silent for weeks. Imprisoned in a cell damp enough to rot leather, denied comfort, pressed daily with threats, he clung to dignity. When at last he spoke, his words were carefully chosen. He admitted that in the rite of initiation, young knights were told to renounce Christ, but only as a test, only as a ritual of humility, meant to strip pride from their hearts. It was never heresy, he insisted, but a trial of faith. But even that half-admission was weaponized. The scribes cut away the nuance, writing only, "The Grand Master confesses to denying Christ." In the court's records, his careful explanation vanished like smoke. The trial dragged on for months. Outside the walls, rumors bloomed. People whispered that the temple had kept secret books, written in languages no one else could read. That they possessed knowledge from the East, alchemy, astronomy, medicine, that made them dangerous to both church and crown. Some whispered of a pact with the devil himself, made on desert sands when the knights had looked too long into foreign mysteries. What is striking is not the truth of these claims, but the hunger with which they were believed. Ordinary folk, who had once left offerings at Templar chapels, now muttered that they had always suspected something strange behind the brothers' silence. A memory twisted quickly when fear was stoked by power. And yet, even amid the flood of confessions, there were sparks of defiance. One night, his body shattered from torture, declared with his last breath, "If I said such things, it was because your fire burned them into me. God knows my soul is clean." Another, dragged before the court with a swollen face and broken fingers, spat at the inquisitor's feet. "I denied nothing save the lies you forced upon me." But defiance rarely survived the flames. By 1310, hundreds of Templars had been interrogated. Dozens recanted their forced confessions, pleading for justice. Some argued openly that the entire process was poisoned, that torture made truth impossible. For a moment, it seemed as if the order might find a flicker of hope. Clement V called for a council to hear the matter properly, with bishops from across Europe. The stage was set for redemption, or for annihilation. What happened next would silence even the council and send the temple deeper into the shadow of legend. The great hall of Paris smelled of wax, sweat, and damp stone. Torches flickered against the vaulted ceiling, throwing restless shadows across the chamber where justice, or something dressed like justice, was about to be staged. The Templars, once knights who had ridden with kings and preached with priests, were herded inside in chains. Their white mantles, marked by the Red Cross, were torn and filthy, many stained with blood from their long confinement. Spectators whispered from the benches above. Merchants, clerks, and lesser nobles leaned forward to see these fallen warriors, men who had once ridden at the head of crusades, reduced to silence by shackles. Some muttered prayers, others smirked, as if witnessing not a trial, but a spectacle. Outside, Paris was alive with rumor. The people had been told the knights were sorcerers, idolaters, men who spat on the cross and whispered vows to demons under the moon. Inside the court, those whispers grew into a chorus of expectation. Surely the accused would now confess. At the far end of the chamber, the king's men sat stiffly beneath banners embroidered with lilies. Their eyes gleamed with something less than justice, ambition, perhaps, or fear. For Philip of France, this was more than a trial. It was theater designed to kill a reputation before it killed an order. One by one, names were read aloud. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Temple, did not appear at first. The younger knights, gaunt from weeks of hunger, stumbled forward. They were asked questions that no true answer could satisfy. Did you deny Christ? Did you kiss the devil's image? Did you worship a head of brass or of stone? Each denial was met with a blow, each hesitation with the promise of worse behind closed doors. When the first confessions were spoken, muttered by lips cracked from thirst, they sounded less like truths and more like rehearsed chants, learned through agony. Still, the scribes dipped their quills eagerly, capturing every syllable as if the words themselves were divine revelation. The crowd leaned in closer. The spectacle was working. The whispers in the court thickened like smoke filling a chamber. They admitted it. The Templars are guilty. But beneath the murmurs, a different kind of silence lingered. The kind that comes when everyone knows the stage has been set long before the curtain rose. Behind the heavy oak doors of the chancery, where sunlight never reached and the air smelled of damp straw, the trial turned into something far darker. Here the voices of clerks and judges were drowned out by the groans of men forced to their knees and the scrape of iron against stone. The inquisitors worked quickly, methodically. A question was asked, a denial recorded, and then the tools of persuasion were introduced. Ropes tightened around wrists until bones popped, flames licked at bare feet, cold water poured until lungs burned. Every no dragged the session deeper into pain. Every yes, no matter how faint, was written down as truth. Did you spit on the cross? A silence. The crack of a staff against the floor. A scream. Yes, the knight gasped. Did you deny Christ 3 times? Yes. Did you worship an idol? A sob. Yes. The answers tumbled out like broken stones, forced into shape by fear and suffering. But they did not match. Some knights swore the idol was a bearded head of silver, others that it was made of wood or brass or even just a shadow. One said it was called Baphomet, though none could explain the word. Still, the scribes wrote, their quills scratching furiously, recording the contradictions as if they were one harmonious truth. Outside these chambers, the rumors multiplied. The word Baphomet spread like wildfire through the taverns of Paris. Men who had once cheered the knights returning from crusade now muttered of witches in armor and Satan's soldiers walking among them. But for those who endured the torment, the shame cut deeper than the lash. These were warriors who had stood before Saracen swords without flinching, now broken by their own countrymen's hands. Some recanted their confessions as soon as the pain eased, insisting their words were born not of guilt, but of torment. Yet the record kept only what the crown desired, and through it all the whispers grew louder. Inside the court, in the streets, in the very halls of the church, the order that had once stood as a pillar of faith was being remade into a monster of shadows and lies. When at last Jacques de Molay was led into the chamber, the atmosphere changed. The guards, who had dragged dozens of broken men through these doors, now moved with a measure of unease. The scribes lifted their heads. Even the inquisitors, who prided themselves on their detachment, paused before speaking. He was an old man now, near 70, but still broad-shouldered, with a gaze that seemed carved from the same granite as the walls that surrounded him. Chains clinked at his wrists and ankles, yet his bearing remained regal, unbent. The very sight of him was a reminder that this was not a petty criminal on trial, but the last grand master of an order that had once rivaled kingdoms. The first questions were simple, delivered in Latin as though ceremony might soften the sting. Did your brothers deny Christ? Did you order them to worship false idols? Do you admit that you yourself spat upon the cross? Molay's answers came with a calm that unsettled the hall. No, he said. We were soldiers of Christ. We swore to protect the Holy Sepulchre, not to desecrate it. No man of mine spat upon the cross, save under duress in this very city. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. The inquisitors frowned. One of them signaled to the torturer standing in the shadows, iron pincers in hand. Yet Molay did not flinch. He lifted his chained hands just slightly, the gesture enough to draw the room's attention. You call this inquiry holy, he said, voice firm. But you know in your hearts it is not justice you serve, but the ambition of a king. You break men until they speak lies to satisfy you. And then you hold those lies as if they were scripture. The chamber fell silent. Scribes hesitated with their quills, caught between duty and the echo of his words. For a moment, it seemed as if the weight of his presence might pierce the ritual itself, expose the theater for what it was. But power rarely yields to truth. The inquisitors pressed forward, their voices sharper now, their threats more pointed. Some accounts claim Molay was tortured, that he too was forced into words he did not mean. Others insist he remained defiant, denying until the end. What is certain is that, unlike many of his brothers, his name was recorded not only in confessions but in curses. He had accused a king and his court of corruption, openly, in front of the recorders. That defiance would echo long after the trials were over. In the streets of Paris, whispers spread faster than the ink could dry. Some said the Grand Master had cursed the king. Others swore that, in refusing to bow, he had bound the fate of France itself. The trial had begun as a spectacle of control, but with Molay's words it became something else, a legend in the making. The court had expected submission. That was how these things were supposed to work. Men were broken, they confessed, they begged forgiveness, and the machinery of authority ground forward without resistance. But Jacques de Molay had refused to fit the script. His words, sharp and unwavering, hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. When the doors opened and he was led back to his cell, the silence in the chamber lingered. The inquisitors scribbled harsher notes than usual, but their pens scratched with unease. For the first time they had been challenged not by shadows of rumor, but by the very man they sought to destroy. Outside, word spread quickly. Servants carried whispers down corridors. Guards, though ordered to silence, muttered what they had heard in taverns after too much wine. The people of Paris, merchants, masons, apprentices, began to question. Were these men truly heretics, as the king claimed, or had they been crushed for no crime but wealth and power? Among the clergy, divisions deepened. Some priests parroted the official line that the Templars had betrayed Christ. Yet others quietly admitted doubts. After all, these knights had shed blood in defense of the Holy Land. Could they so easily have turned to idolatry and blasphemy? Rumors multiplied like wildfire. Some claimed that de Molay had cursed the king to his face, naming a day when judgment would fall. Others swore they had seen omens in the sky above the Seine, a blood-red moon, a flock of crows circling the palace roof. Whether true or not, such stories spread faster than parchment proclamations. For Philip IV, this was dangerous. His aim had been to crush the order swiftly and decisively, to strip them of wealth and erase their name. But the Grand Master's defiance gave the people something harder to silence, a narrative of resistance. In the marketplace, women selling bread spoke of a king afraid of knights too loyal to be bought. In the workshops, apprentices muttered that perhaps the true heresy lay not in the temple, but on the throne. The machinery of power responded as it always did. Preachers were sent to the streets to repeat the charges. Scribes copied new pamphlets, each darker than the last, painting the Templars as sorcerers and demons, and still the murmurs persisted. What had begun as a trial now became something else entirely, a contest of stories. On one side, the crown's carefully crafted tale of treachery and sin. On the other, the whispered defiance of an old man in chains echoing through taverns and alleyways. The court did not know it yet, but the shadow cast by that defiance would outlive them all. Clement V sat in Avignon, a city that was not quite Rome and not quite France, but something uncomfortably in between. The papacy had drifted here under the shadow of French influence, and Clement himself, once Bertrand de Got, Archbishop of Bordeaux, owed his elevation to the throne of St. Peter largely to King Philip's maneuvering. This was both his shield and his prison. Reports of the Templars' arrest reached him like a storm tide, each dispatch heavier than the last. Philip's accusations were blunt: heresy, idolatry, obscene rituals, spitting on the cross, worshipping a demon's head, unnatural practices. If even half of it were true, it would shatter the very foundations of Christendom. But Clement knew too well how often politics dressed itself in the language of faith. In the quiet hours of night, he wondered, was he shepherd of the universal church, or was he already a pawn on the Capetian chessboard? If he openly defied Philip, he risked tearing apart the fragile balance between France and the papacy. If he supported the king too quickly, he would be remembered as the pope who betrayed one of Christendom's greatest military orders. Letters came from across Europe. Some monarchs were cautious. England's Edward II hesitated, skeptical of France's motives. Others, like Aragon, seemed eager to see the Templars humbled, their lands seized. The tide was shifting, and Clement could feel the undertow pulling him down. He called for an inquiry, a papal investigation to examine the charges independently. It was a careful move, meant to assert authority without alienating the French king. But Philip was not a man who tolerated delay. His pressure was relentless. Through envoys and emissaries, he reminded the Pope of past favors and of debts that could be called due. Whispers ran through Avignon's corridors. The Templars had too much wealth, too much independence, too much arrogance. Some said their banking network rivaled the papal treasury itself. Others murmured about secrets, arcane rites, hidden relics, even bloodlines stretching back to the Temple of Solomon. Clement could not know what was true, but he knew this: truth mattered less than perception, and Philip was shaping the narrative faster than the Pope could respond. So, Clement hesitated. He wrote letters of sympathy to the arrested Templars, yet also authorized limited trials. He walked a line so thin it could scarcely bear his weight. To his advisers, he confessed that he felt trapped between Scylla and Charybdis, between the wrath of a king and the ruin of his own conscience. The bells of Avignon tolled as winter drew near, their sound echoing through the stone halls of the papal palace. And in his private chapel, Clement knelt before the crucifix, whispering prayers not for victory, but for escape from the fate that was closing in around him. The inquiries Clement had ordered were meant to slow the storm, but instead, they fed it. The confessions arriving from France were grotesque. Men claiming they spat on the cross at initiation, kissed one another obscenely, or worshipped a mysterious idol said to be shaped like a human head. Yet Clement knew too well the hand of torture when he saw its mark. These were words forced out through pain, not freely spoken truth. Still, parchment stacked higher each week, ink running with charges, names, testimonies, each one reinforcing Philip's case. The king's envoys pressed into Avignon with veiled threats. "Holy Father," one of them said, bowing low but with steel in his eyes, "if Rome hesitates, France must act alone. Better to cleanse the church swiftly than to let corruption spread." Clement's counselors were divided. Some urged defiance to remind Philip that no crown stood above the papacy. Others whispered pragmatism. What was one order of knights compared to the survival of the Holy See itself? If the Pope resisted too strongly, France might pull its clergy away, leaving the church fractured. Clement had seen schism before. He dreaded it more than he dreaded Philip. The pressure grew heavier still when word reached Avignon that Philip had secured much of the Templars' wealth already. Fortresses emptied, treasuries seized, their banking houses stripped bare, the king moved faster than the Pope's pen could write. With every coin Philip collected, Clement's position weakened. In a rare moment of candor, Clement confessed to his private secretary that he felt as though he was watching a man bleed out, knowing he had the means to save him but fearing the knife more than the wound. "The order is guilty of pride," he admitted quietly. But is pride heresy? And yet something deeper haunted him. Reports hinted that within the Templar vaults lay not only wealth, but relics. Some said fragments of the true cross. Others whispered of the Holy Grail, or documents that could shake Christendom if revealed. Were these lies crafted by enemies, or secrets the Pope himself was safer not knowing? Clement began to suspect that he was not fighting for truth at all, but for control of a story that had grown too big to master. The longer he delayed, the more he became complicit in Philip's campaign. Delay became silence. Silence became consent. And so, on parchment sealed with the fisherman's ring, Clement reluctantly issued bulls that authorized further trials, allowing Philip's machinery to grind forward under the banner of papal legitimacy. As the ink dried, the Pope sat alone in his chamber, the candlelight flickering against his tired eyes. He knew he had crossed a threshold. From now on, no matter how the story ended, his name would be chained to it. The great fortress of the Templars was falling, and Clement V, willingly or not, had opened the gates. The year turned, but Clement's knights did not ease. Reports from Paris spoke of Templars paraded in chains, of bonfires where knights once sworn to the cross now stood as heretics, recanting their faith in trembling voices. Some withdrew their confessions as soon as the torture stopped, but their words were ignored. The spectacle was too useful for Philip to abandon. In Avignon, the papal court was split into factions. Cardinals debated not theology, but survival. One side urging that Clement wrest control back from Philip, the other insisting that to challenge the king now would doom the papacy to irrelevance. Each meeting ended the same way. Silence. The Pope's thin hands trembling on the table, his lips pressed into a line. Letters poured in from across Europe. Edward of England, cautious, held back from outright persecution but watched carefully. The German princes asked bluntly if Philip's accusations had any foundation or if this was merely a convenient theft of wealth. Merchants complained that the sudden seizure of Templar treasuries had disrupted credit and trade. It was becoming clear that Philip's war on the Templars was also a war on Europe's financial stability. Clement tried one last maneuver. He summoned commissions to examine the order independently, beyond French borders. He hoped that if testimonies in England or the Iberian kingdoms came back clean, he could counterbalance Philip's poisoned case. But the machinery of rumor was faster than the machinery of truth. Even before inquiries began, whispers of heresy reached every town square, every tavern, every pulpit. The Templars, once protectors of pilgrims, had become in the public mind shadowy idolaters. And then came the blow Clement could not ignore. Word arrived that Philip had arranged for dozens of knights to be burned alive in Paris, men who had retracted their confessions and proclaimed their innocence, even as the flames rose around them. Witnesses swore they shouted prayers, not blasphemies, their cries echoing against the walls of Notre Dame itself. When Clement heard, he slammed his hand on the council table, the only time his household ever saw him erupt in fury. This was not justice, he spat. This was murder under the sign of the lily. For a brief, dangerous moment, he considered excommunicating the King of France. But the thought died as quickly as it rose. He knew the papacy had no army, no treasury strong enough to resist, no ally willing to draw sword for the temple, and so he bent. At Vienne, in 1312, under the suffocating presence of French pressure, Clement declared the order of the temple suppressed, not condemned for heresy outright. A careful distinction, but a hollow mercy. Their property was to be transferred to the Hospitallers, though Philip ensured much of it never left his grasp. When the bull was read aloud, Clement sat in his throne, his eyes half shuttered, as if he had already withdrawn into himself. Those close to him said he looked less like a pope pronouncing judgment than like a man signing his own confession. By yielding, he had preserved the papacy's fragile peace. But he had also allowed Philip's vengeance to write itself into holy law. The order of the temple was gone. The seal was broken. And in the echoing silence left behind, Europe whispered, if even the Knights of God could fall, who was safe? The chambers where the Templars were held were nothing like the fortresses they once commanded. In Paris, dozens were packed into damp stone cells beneath the royal courts, airless caverns where torches smoked and straw rotted underfoot. Chains clinked whenever a man shifted in sleep, if sleep could be found at all. When the guards came, they came with purpose, to fetch another knight for interrogation. The word itself, interrogation, was a veil. What awaited in the adjoining chamber was a theater of cruelty that had long since perfected its scripts. Brother Amory of Poitiers later described in a trembling deposition how he was strung by his wrists until his shoulders tore. Another, a grizzled knight named Geoffrey of Charny, was forced to watch younger brothers beaten with rods until his silence cracked. Some were pressed with red-hot irons. Others starved until madness loosened their tongues. The confessions collected by Philip's commissioners read like a ledger of invention. One knight admitted to spitting on the cross at initiation, another to denying Christ altogether. Some swore they had worshipped a head with silver eyes. Others, half-conscious from the rack, muttered yes to anything asked of them. But among these grim documents there were flickers of resistance. In England, where the king was less eager to bend to Philip's fury, many Templars denied the charges outright. In Aragon and Portugal, testimony often spoke of piety and loyalty, not heresy. Even in France, after the first wave of torture passed, knights began to retract their confessions. One man declared publicly, before the bishops, that he had lied to save his life, and would rather face death than betray his brothers with falsehoods. Still, Philip's machinery ground on. At trial after trial, the image of the Templar darkened. Preachers thundered against their sins. Scribes filled pages with accusations that blurred fact and rumor. The people of Paris, once accustomed to seeing white mantles riding at the head of armies, now gathered to jeer as those same mantles were paraded in chains. The trials were not only legal proceedings. They were performances. Each staged confession, each public burning, was designed to overwrite memory, to transform knights of Christ into figures of suspicion. And slowly it worked. Markets buzzed with gossip. Had the temple really worshipped Baphomet? Did they really spit on the cross to prove their loyalty? Children whispered about demons in the vaults of their commanderies. But the knights themselves, in their dwindling hours, spoke differently. In fragments of letters smuggled out by sympathetic clerks, they wrote not of heresy, but of betrayal. They swore oaths of innocence, declared their fidelity to Christ, and pleaded that history remember them not as heretics, but as martyrs of politics. These scraps, fragile as the parchment they were written on, are all that remains of voices once carried proudly across battlefields, and reading them one cannot help but feel the chill of injustice, men condemned not by truth but by convenience. The stage was set for one final act, one that would mark the end of the temple not just as an order, but as a myth burned into the conscience of Christendom. The March wind was sharp on the Ile de la Cité, cutting down the narrow streets of Paris and sweeping across the Seine. On that morning in 1314, the city gathered in silence. Not for a festival, not for a coronation, but for the spectacle of fire. 2 men were led from the dungeons of the palace, Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Temple, and Geoffrey de Charny, preceptor of Normandy. Their white mantles had been stripped from them, their bodies thinned by years of captivity. Yet their steps were steady, and their voices, when they spoke, rang louder than the king or pope had planned. De Molay, lifting his face to the crowd, declared his innocence. He spoke, not like a man pleading for mercy, but like one delivering judgment. God knows who is in the wrong and who has sinned. Before long, those who have condemned us shall face him with dread." Geoffrey de Charny echoed him, his words rising above the hiss of torches. Together, they retracted the confessions torn from them by torture. The royal commissioners froze. This was not the script. The two knights were meant to confess once more, to accept absolution, and to be quietly condemned to life imprisonment. Instead, they had turned the stage against their captors, choosing fire over silence. Philip's men reacted swiftly. The order was given. Stakes were raised at the edge of the island, where the Seine's waters met the stone quay. Bundles of wood crackled as they were piled high. The crowd pressed forward, some weeping, others awestruck as the flames were lit. De Molay's last words, carried by the wind, lingered like a curse, that Pope Clement, King Philip, and all who had judged the temple would answer before God within the year. According to chroniclers, the prophecy came true. Clement died a month later, Philip within the year, and many of his allies soon after. To the people of Paris, it seemed as though the fire had not ended the temple. It had only transformed it into legend. The pyres burned until nightfall. By morning, there was nothing left but ash swept into the river, carried away on the current. No relics were saved, no bones entombed. And yet, in that emptiness, the order of the temple began its second life, not as warriors of flesh and blood, but as shadows in history. From that day forward, whispers spread that de Molay's curse had doomed a dynasty, that treasures had been hidden before the arrests, that secret rites had survived in silence. What had been destroyed in Paris rose again in imagination. The knights who had once ridden openly beneath the cross now rode invisibly in stories, their presence haunting every rumor of forbidden knowledge and buried gold. And so, with the flames of March 1314, the visible temple ended. But the invisible one, the temple of myths, secrets, and bloodlines, was only beginning. When the ashes of Jacques de Molay drifted into the Seine, it seemed as if the temple had been erased. But across Christendom, the echoes of that fire reached farther than Philip's crown, or Clement's decree could ever stretch. In England, King Edward II hesitated. He had no love for the Templars, but he lacked Philip's zeal. The arrests came later, less brutal, and the trials lacked the drama of Paris. Some knights were fined, others given pensions. Their castles were handed over to the Hospitallers on parchment, but in practice, local lords kept much for themselves. The temple dissolved, not in blood and flames, but in quiet confiscations and paperwork. And yet, in certain villages, people swore that men in white mantles still rode the lanes by night, vanishing before dawn. In Spain and Portugal, the story was different. There, the frontier still burned with wars against the Moors, and kings knew the value of seasoned warriors. Rather than destroy the temple, they reshaped it. In Portugal, King Denis transformed it into the Order of Christ, with new banners but the same knights beneath them. Their red cross would later sail across oceans on the caravels of Prince Henry the Navigator, carrying the ghost of the temple into the Age of Discovery. In Aragon and Castile, similar adaptations took place. Lands were redistributed, some brothers absorbed into local orders, others left to fade into monastic obscurity. The flame that consumed the temple in France sputtered into embers here, still glowing in unexpected ways. And then there was Scotland. Officially, Clement's decree applied there too. But Scotland was excommunicated. Its king, Robert the Bruce, declared an outlaw by the Pope. When word of the arrests reached the north, many believed that Templars fleeing France found refuge on those rugged coasts. Chroniclers of later centuries would claim that they fought at Bannockburn in 1314, turning the tide of battle with a sudden charge of mysterious knights. Whether true or myth, the idea rooted itself in Scottish soil, becoming part of the story of independence. From Portugal's harbors to Scotland's glens, the temple survived in fragments, sometimes legal, sometimes hidden, sometimes only in memory. And memory, unlike castles or coins, could not be seized by any king. Meanwhile, across Europe, ordinary people whispered of curses, of treasure, of secret oaths carried on in silence. Every empty chapel, every weather-worn cross carved in stone became a possible clue. And in that vacuum of certainty, the order grew more powerful in death than it ever had in life. For if history had ended the temple on the Ile de la Cité, legend was just beginning to write its next chapter. After the smoke cleared in Paris and the official seals closed the last Templar commanderies, something peculiar began to happen. Instead of fading into silence, the order seemed to multiply in rumor. In taverns, people whispered that not all the knights had been captured, that a fleet of Templar ships had slipped out of La Rochelle under cover of night, vanishing into the Atlantic. Some said they reached Scotland. Others swore they sailed as far as the New World, long before Columbus ever dreamed of it. The church declared these tales nonsense, but the more authorities denied, the more the stories grew. Secret orders began to appear across Europe, borrowing the language, symbols, and mystique of the Templars. In Italy and Germany, small brotherhoods styled themselves after the temple, claiming spiritual inheritance even if they had no blood tie. Some were devotional, meeting to pray at midnight by candlelight. Others, perhaps less holy, sought to harness the aura of Templar power for their own politics and plots. By the 17th century, the most famous of these whispers wrapped itself around the birth of Freemasonry. In the lodges of London and Edinburgh, stonemasons turned philosophers began to claim that their craft descended from the temple itself. They spoke of a hidden line of masters who carried forward the secrets of Solomon's temple, preserved in codes and rituals that only initiates could understand. Did the Freemasons truly inherit the Templar legacy, or did they simply adopt its aura? That question has never been answered. But in the candlelit chambers of lodges, symbols of the temple, swords, crosses, the seal of two knights on one horse, appeared, repurposed as emblems of moral brotherhood. And then came the bloodline myths. Across France, pamphlets circulated whispering that the temple had preserved not just gold or relics, but a sacred genealogy. Descendants of Christ himself, hidden within noble houses, protected by the order. The church denounced it as heresy, but the rumor was stronger than any decree. Even centuries later, novelists, occultists, and conspirators would return to it, weaving webs that tied the Templars to everything from the Holy Grail to revolutions. The farther the temple receded into history, the more its shadow stretched. What had been an order of knights became, in imagination, a secret society stretching beneath the whole of Europe. If the Templars were destroyed in fire, then their ashes were scattered into myth. One story insists that Jacques de Molay, bound to the stake in Paris, did not merely cry out in pain, he called down judgment. With smoke filling his lungs and flames crawling up his robe, he declared that both the Pope and the King would soon stand before God's tribunal. Within a year, Clement V lay dead, and Philip IV followed. To many, this was proof that the temple had not gone quietly, but had left behind a curse. From that moment, the Templars were no longer just warriors. They became symbols of divine vengeance, of hidden power that even kings could not extinguish. Peasants whispered the curse like a folk charm. Nobles repeated it in salons. Every misfortune that befell the French crown seemed to echo Molay's final words. But the curse was only one thread. The other was far older, the question of what the Templars had guarded beneath Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Some chroniclers wrote of relics, pieces of the true cross, sacred vessels, or even the Ark itself. Others, centuries later, added a more audacious claim that the Templars had discovered and preserved the Holy Grail. The Grail was not yet the romantic chalice of Arthurian legend. It was shifting, elusive, sometimes a cup, sometimes a stone, sometimes a bloodline. And in each telling, the Templars appeared as its secret keepers. The Order's sudden destruction only fueled this. If they had nothing, why such ferocity from crown and pope? Surely, people reasoned, they guarded a treasure that could shake Christendom. In the monasteries of southern France, troubadours sang of Grail Knights. In castles of Germany, murals were painted of knights guarding vessels of light. By the Enlightenment, philosophers were convinced that the temple had preserved something beyond gold, knowledge perhaps, or a key to man's place in the cosmos. These legends gave the Templars a strange second life. Where history had ended them in chains, myth resurrected them in cloaks of secrecy. In every century that followed, new societies would claim descent: Rosicrucians, mystic lodges, and even fringe sects of Freemasons. The irony is sharp. An order that began as humble protectors of pilgrims ended as eternal ghosts, forever invoked, forever reimagined. Their true archives may have been lost, but in story, they became immortal. By the 17th century, the smoke of the pyres had long since vanished, yet the name of the Templars lingered like embers beneath ash. In the courts of Europe, whispers began again, not of knights on horseback, but of lodges, hidden brotherhoods, and ancient secrets that survived the flames. In Prague, alchemists swore that certain Templar seals, handed down in secrecy, contained formulas for transmuting metals into gold. In Paris, pamphlets accused shadowy Templiers noirs of guiding revolutions from behind closed doors. And in London, coffee houses, men spoke of a chain unbroken, of initiations passed from knight to mason, sealed in candlelight. The 18th century brought a fever for secret societies. Freemasonry spread like wildfire, attracting nobles, philosophers, and merchants alike. And into that atmosphere, the Templars re-emerged, not as warriors, but as symbols. Masonic rites began to include Templar degrees, elaborate ceremonies where initiates swore oaths beneath banners of the Red Cross. It was theater, yes, but also belief, a conviction that the torch had been passed from those burned at the stake to those now whispering in darkened chambers. Poets fueled the revival. Goethe imagined Templar spirits in his works. Painters filled canvases with hooded figures guarding chalices. In Germany and Scotland, entire Neo-Templar orders sprang up, blending Christian mysticism, alchemy, and political intrigue. For some, the Templars symbolized the purest knighthood: courage, sacrifice, brotherhood. For others, they were custodians of something more dangerous: knowledge meant to destabilize church and crown. The ambiguity made them irresistible. Even Napoleon could not resist invoking them. When he marched into the Middle East, he styled himself as heir to crusaders, hinting at Templar echoes. Some claimed he sought relics buried beneath the sands. Others believed he courted the legend of a grail still hidden. The irony is that, in reality, the Templars had long ceased to exist as an institution. Their last members were dust, their lands divided, their archives destroyed or lost. But in imagination, in song, in ritual, in the fevered dreams of revolutionaries, they became eternal. It was as though the fire that consumed Jacques de Molay had not ended the order, but released it into 1,000 myths, each reshaping the knights into whatever an age most desired: martyrs, magicians, rebels, prophets. And so by the dawn of the 19th century, the Templars were no longer a memory, they were a mirror. Each generation peered into them and saw what it most feared or most longed for. By the 19th century, the Templar legend had swollen far beyond the ashes of their real history. What had once been a dissolved military order became, in the imagination of Europe, a vessel for every whispered secret. The most dangerous of these whispers was not about gold or relics, but about blood. The idea was intoxicating. What if the Templars had not died at the stake? What if their leaders had carried with them a secret too precious to burn, a lineage, a bloodline, traced not just to ancient kings, but to Christ himself? French writers were the first to feed the notion. Pulp histories hinted that noble families of Languedoc, the same region where Cathar heretics once resisted Rome, were guardians of the true heirs. Pamphlets suggested that during their expeditions in the Holy Land, the Templars uncovered genealogies deliberately suppressed by the Church. The story spread like wildfire because it turned the narrative upside down. If true, then the Church had not destroyed heretics. It had silenced the rightful heirs of Christ's mission. And the Templars, far from being traitors, had been protectors of the truth. Romantics adored the idea. Secret societies built entire rituals around the sang real, the royal blood, which centuries later would morph into the modern Holy Grail myth. Painters sketched shadowy figures passing swaddled infants across stormy seas. Poets described knights shielding fragile scrolls beneath their cloaks. Of course, historians groaned. The records of 1307 show no such revelations, no scrolls, no secret heirs. Yet the absence of evidence only made the myth more tantalizing. People love what the church tried to erase. Silence sounds louder than truth. And so, in the back rooms of Paris and Edinburgh, new orders were formed. Not the old Templars, but reflections of them. Groups who believed that their blood or their initiation tied them to something larger. The continuation of a hidden royal line. This idea shaped politics too. Monarchists in France whispered that the revolution had been the church's final punishment for betraying the Templars. Republicans, in turn, claimed that the knights had carried forward the spirit of resistance, a spirit that toppled kings. Both sides bent the myth to their will. By the dawn of the 20th century, the bloodline legend had crystallized. It was no longer just whispers in salons. Books were published, novels circulated. Societies gave lectures in candlelit halls. What had begun as the tragedy of a knightly order was now the seed of an idea that still haunts us today. That somewhere, somehow, a family walks among us carrying the blood of Christ, guarded by the shadows of the temple. If blood was the secret that captured Europe's imagination, treasure was the flame that kept the myth alive. No tale of the Templars ever lasted long before someone whispered, "But what about the gold?" Contemporary records tell us the knights were wealthy, yes. They owned fertile lands across Christendom, collected rents, and provided banking services to kings. Yet, on the night of their arrest in 1307, little was seized. The royal guards expected wagons of silver, vaults of coin, reliquaries studded with gems. Instead, they found inventories, farm tools, and a few modest chests. It was almost insulting. Where, then, had the treasure gone? That single unanswered question seeded one of history's most enduring obsessions. Chronicles written decades later described carts rolling away from Paris in the dead of night, guarded by a handful of knights who slipped past the king's soldiers. Others swore the Templar fleet. Dozens of ships docked at La Rochelle, vanished into the mist and was never seen again. Had they sailed to Scotland, to Portugal, to the New World centuries before Columbus? As the centuries passed, the treasure transformed from mere wealth into something greater. In Protestant Europe, it was said the Templars had spirited away heretical gospels, writings too dangerous for the Vatican to allow. In France, legends whispered that sacred relics, the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, had been locked in Templar vaults beneath Rennes-le-Château. In Spain, stories placed their hidden troves beneath monasteries, guarded by curses. It didn't matter that historians scoffed. Treasure maps circulated anyway. Nobles ruined themselves digging beneath ruined commanderies. Entire villages were convinced their wells were once hiding places. Even in the 20th century, adventurers were still cutting into the hills of Languedoc and the catacombs of Paris in search of glittering proof. But here is the truth. The treasure was not gold. It was the myth itself. The power of belief turned parchment into prophecy, ruins into gateways, silence into certainty. Every culture that touched the Templar story bent it into its own shape. In Scotland, the lost fleet became the force that secured Robert the Bruce's victory at Bannockburn. In Portugal, it became the hidden foundation of the Order of Christ, which sponsored voyages to the edge of the world. In America, it morphed into tales of oak-choked islands and mysterious stone markings. The irony: the more the treasure was sought, the less it mattered whether it ever existed. The chase became the story. And with each generation of treasure hunters, the Templars were reborn, not as men in armor, but as shadows behind the veil of history. The Vatican's official stance on the Templars has always been a paradox. On paper, the order was dissolved. In the Bull Vox in Excelso, Pope Clement V declared their statutes abolished, their property transferred to the Hospitallers, their name erased from Christendom. To the faithful, the message was clear: the Templars no longer existed. And yet, silence lingered. Behind closed doors, the Vatican archives kept their trial records sealed for centuries. The testimonies, the confessions under torture, the papal correspondence, all hidden from scholars until the modern age. That secrecy created a fertile ground for whispers. If the Templars had truly been guilty, why not trumpet their crimes? If they had been innocent, why not clear their names? The Church's half-answers became fuel for speculation. More telling still was the Church's own use of Templar symbols. The Red Cross faded from banners, yes, but variations reappeared in other orders. The Order of Christ in Portugal, the Calatrava in Spain, the Teutonic Knights in Germany. Even in Rome's own liturgy, prayers once used by the Templars were quietly repurposed. To outside eyes, it seemed less like eradication and more like transformation. And then there were the relics. Pilgrims whispered that chalices, crucifixes, even fragments of the true cross once guarded by the Templars were quietly absorbed into Vatican treasuries. No public acknowledgement was made, but inventories hint at objects transferred from suppressed orders. They were not destroyed, they were simply moved. This careful ambivalence allowed the Vatican to play both sides of the legend. To kings, it could say, "We ended the heresy." To common folk, it could shrug, "The knights are gone." But who can know the full truth of God's mysteries? That space between certainty and doubt became the breeding ground of myth. Over time, Rome's silence was interpreted as complicity. In Reformation Europe, Protestants accused the papacy of hoarding Templar secrets to preserve its own power. In Enlightenment circles, the Templars were recast as martyrs of reason, crushed by superstition. Even revolutionaries in France claimed to avenge Jacques de Molay's death at the stake when they stormed the Bastille. The irony is rich. By seeking to erase the order, the Vatican ensured its immortality. The myths that grew were not controlled from Rome, but Rome's refusal to clarify gave them oxygen. The Holy See had learned a dangerous truth. Sometimes, not answering is more powerful than answering. The silence of the Vatican did not remain confined to Rome. Like a stone dropped into water, it sent ripples outward, reshaping the imaginations of centuries. In the absence of a clear verdict, Europe itself began to write the Templars' afterlife. By the 17th century, secret societies flourished in taverns, guild halls, and candle-lit chambers. Among the most prominent, the Freemasons. While their earliest lodges were gatherings of craftsmen, they quickly adopted the aura of ancient wisdom. And in that hunger for legitimacy, they looked to the Templars. It was not proof they sought, but lineage. Rituals began to echo knightly vows. Initiations invoked imagery of the Holy Land, and Masonic degrees were adorned with crosses that looked suspiciously familiar. Some claimed their grandmasters had preserved Templar bloodlines, hidden for generations. Others swore that surviving knights had fled into Scotland, finding refuge beneath the stony walls of Rosslyn Chapel. These were not idle myths. They gave the societies a sense of sacred purpose. To belong was not merely to gather in fellowship. It was to inherit a mission the Church itself had tried to bury. Whether true or false, the Templar connection electrified the imagination. The Vatican, of course, dismissed these whispers. Yet its refusal to openly confront or debunk them only deepened the fascination. By the Enlightenment, writers and revolutionaries wore the Templar name as a badge of defiance. Voltaire described them as victims of tyranny. Revolutionaries in Paris, when executing King Louis XVI, were said to shout that they were avenging Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master. Even in America, across the ocean, the myth took root. Early Freemasons among the Founding Fathers carried with them the same symbols, the compass, the square, the unfinished temple, that some insisted were the afterglow of a Templar inheritance. Was it coincidence that so many revolutionary leaders wore Masonic aprons, or was it the faint echo of a suppressed order breathing through a new republic? None of this can be proven, but that is the point. The Vatican's silence created fertile ground for invention. The less the Church said, the more others filled in the gaps. The Templars became mirrors, reflecting the hopes, fears, and rebellions of each generation. By the 19th century, they were no longer merely a lost order of knights. They were symbols of resistance, of forbidden knowledge, of secrets just out of reach. Writers turned them into shadowy guardians of relics, keepers of Christ's bloodline, conspirators against kings. Painters cast them as tragic martyrs cloaked in flames. And through it all, the Vatican held its silence. The truth was locked away in archives, guarded by men who would never speak of it aloud. And so, the myth became stronger than the memory. There is a certain kind of story that refuses to die. It doesn't matter how many times it has been denied, how many scholars wave their hands and say, nonsense. It lingers because it speaks to something deeper. The human desire for continuity, for a thread that ties us to the divine. The most daring claim about the Templars is not about gold or relics, but blood. It begins with whispers that during their time in the Holy Land, the Knights uncovered a secret buried beneath the stones of Jerusalem. Some say it was the bones of a king, others, the chalice from the Last Supper. But the most radical version is this. They discovered evidence that Christ had left descendants, a bloodline that had flowed quietly through the centuries. According to this tale, the Templars became guardians not only of relics, but of people, protectors of families whose ancestry traced back to that sacred line. When the order fell in 1307, those families became scattered, hidden in plain sight, folded into the nobility of France, Spain, and beyond. Some even claim that marriages between certain houses of Europe, the de Bouillon, the St. Clairs, the Plantagenets, were arranged not merely for politics, but to preserve this holy seed. The Vatican would call it blasphemy. To the Church, Christ's divinity could not be reduced to flesh and children. But to the storytellers of the centuries, it was irresistible. Imagine, the Son of God not as unreachable, but as an ancestor, his blood quietly coursing through the veins of princes and rebels alike. By the Renaissance, genealogies began appearing, drawing tenuous lines between saints and kings, knights and mystics. In dusty manuscripts passed hand to hand, one name reappeared. Merovingians, the Frankish dynasty said by some to carry sacred blood. And if you listen to the theories spun in taverns and whispered in monasteries, it was the Templars who kept that bloodline alive. Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, with its carved vines and hidden figures, is often pointed to as a reliquary not for gold, but for lineage. Some go further still, claiming that the New World itself was mapped and settled in part by men safeguarding descendants of that line, carrying the living grail across the Atlantic to begin anew. Does any of this rest on solid evidence? No. But myths rarely do. What matters is how the idea burrowed into the collective imagination. Secret societies clung to it. Novelists embroidered it. Revolutionaries adopted it as a myth of legitimacy. Even today, films and thrillers lean on this idea of a secret bloodline, guarded by swords and silence, opposed by the Vatican's stone-faced denial. What is undeniable is this: silence breeds stories, and stories breed belief. And the Vatican's refusal to speak openly about what the Templars truly found in Jerusalem left a wound that was quickly filled by rumor, poetry, and obsession. So when you hear the word Templar, you may not think of bankers or farmers turned soldiers. You think of secrets. You think of blood. You think of something the Church didn't want you to know. For centuries after 1307, the Vatican carried the stain of the Templars' destruction. It was not only the brutality of the arrests, or the torture, or the strange confessions dragged from broken bodies. It was the silence afterward, a silence that begged to be filled. And when silence lasts too long, myths bloom like weeds in abandoned gardens. By the 15th century, Rome began to realize that the Templar story was slipping away from them. In taverns, the knights were no longer remembered as heretics but as martyrs. In secret halls, they were whispered about as keepers of Christ's greatest secrets. Their enemies had meant to erase them. Instead, they had been transformed into legend. So the Vatican tried a new strategy: rewriting. Papal scribes commissioned carefully worded chronicles where the Templars were mentioned only in passing, folded into the broader history of crusades and kings. The official line became, "They were dissolved for corruption, and the church moved on." A neat full stop. But the people did not move on. Pilgrims still visited old Templar churches, still swore that strange symbols carved into their stones meant more than decoration. In France, peasants would point to ruined commanderies and say, "That's where the gold is buried." In Scotland, ballads sang of knights who sailed west under blood-red sails, carrying something too dangerous for Rome to ever claim. The Vatican doubled down. New orders were elevated. The Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, each presented as the true heirs of crusading piety, meant to overshadow the Templars' memory. Yet the more they insisted, the more it looked like they were trying to bury something, and suspicion is a fire that spreads faster than faith. By the 16th century, even reformers like Martin Luther accused the papacy of hiding forbidden knowledge, not only indulgences and corruption, but relics and truths too explosive to reveal. The Templars became a weapon in this narrative, proof that Rome feared knowledge it could not control. Did the Vatican succeed in reshaping the memory? Only partly. Their archives remain locked, their statements vague. But outside their walls, the legend of the Templars, guardians of relics, keepers of bloodlines, enemies of tyranny, only grew. And so the question remains, did the Church's attempt to rewrite the past protect its authority, or accidentally fuel the very myth it feared most? Behind the polished facade of papal decrees and rewritten chronicles, another story unfolded, one that never appeared in public sermons but lived in locked chests and whispered corridors. Inside the Vatican archives, where even today only a handful of scholars are permitted to walk, a collection of black books was said to be stored. Not books in the ordinary sense, but bundles of parchment, sealed by wax, containing the confessions of Templar leaders, testimonies extracted under torture, and letters intercepted between fleeing knights. To most of Europe, these documents were lost or destroyed. To the Vatican, they were leverage. Whispers tell of a pope who once threatened to reveal them to silence a rebellious French king. Another story claims that within these parchments lay references not only to idolatry, but to something more dangerous, the suggestion that the Templars had knowledge of Christ's bloodline, or at least a relic that challenged the Church's monopoly on salvation. None of this could be proven, because proof was never allowed to surface. That was the true power of the archives. By keeping the confessions hidden, the Church could decide which pieces to release and when. And what is mystery, if not the perfect tool of control? But secrecy is fragile. Copies were rumored to exist. A rogue cardinal in the 1400s allegedly slipped a few pages to a Florentine banker, sparking stories of hidden heirs. Centuries later, when Napoleon invaded Rome, his men carted off hundreds of crates from the archives, some of which vanished before they reached Paris. Ever since, hunters of the Templar truth have wondered, did those missing crates contain the key to the order's fate? Meanwhile, in sermons and official histories, the papacy doubled down on the narrative of corrupt knights justly punished. But outside the vaulted ceilings of Rome, taverns and universities carried another version, that the Vatican was afraid. Afraid of what the Templars had seen in Jerusalem, afraid of what they might have carried back to Europe, afraid that their knowledge could burn down the walls of Christendom. The paradox was sharp. The more the Vatican tried to bury the memory, the more they convinced the world that there was something worth hiding. And so the story of the Templars, far from fading into dust, grew teeth. It began, as most dangerous ideas do, with a whisper. In the years after the Templars' fall, fragments of rumor drifted through Europe. Some said certain knights had escaped with treasure. Others said they had carried something far more valuable, knowledge. Not just maps of buried gold, but names, bloodlines that stretched back to the Holy Land. To the common peasant, this meant little. But to kings, bishops, and rival orders, the possibility was electric. If the Templars had indeed traced a line from Christ's own family, or if they had discovered descendants who lived quietly in Europe, the entire edifice of papal power would tremble. The Church was built not just on scripture, but on authority. and authority rested on the idea that Christ's legacy flowed through Rome, not through flesh and blood. The first sparks came from southern France, where Cathar survivors and Templar sympathizers wove together their defeats into prophecy. They spoke of a sang real, a royal blood. Later storytellers would twist the phrase into San Graal, the Holy Grail, giving birth to a legend so malleable it could be carried across centuries like contraband. By the 1400s, in the courts of Burgundy and Aragon, genealogists began compiling suspiciously elaborate family trees. Noble houses claimed descent from obscure figures said to be linked with Jerusalem. Some whispered that entire dynasties were constructed as shields to protect a hidden heir, a living reminder of what the Vatican had tried to erase. But evidence was always slippery. A torn manuscript here, a carved symbol on a church lintel there, a name that seemed out of place in baptismal records. Nothing that could stand in a court of law. Everything that could set fire to imagination, and imagination spread faster than decree. In Florence, poets painted Christ not as a distant god, but as a man whose blood might still flow through veins of men. In Prague, mystics claimed visions of a veiled woman carrying a child across the Alps, watched over by knights in white mantles. In Scotland, where fugitive Templars were rumored to have fled, folk songs told of lords with the lion's mark, a symbol some claimed tied them to the tribe of Judah. Each story was small, isolated, but together they formed a current too strong to stop. The Vatican, sensing the danger, reacted as it always did, with silence and suppression. Inquisitors burned manuscripts. Chroniclers were ordered to omit names. Bishops warned from the pulpit that no blood could redeem, only the cross. But the harder they pressed, the more the question echoed. What if the Templars carried not just relics, but living proof that Christ's bloodline survived? A question that, once asked, could never be unasked. If whispers kept the legend alive in the Middle Ages, it was in the Renaissance that those whispers grew teeth. Italy was not just a land of painters and poets. It was a chessboard where families like the Medici and Borgia battled for power through marriage, money, and murder. In such a world, a rumor about royal blood hidden in obscure lineages was not superstition. It was political currency. Secret societies began to coalesce, not always as grand as later myth would make them, but tight circles of scholars, nobles, and clergy who exchanged forbidden manuscripts and studied symbols in candlelit chambers. One such network in Florence spoke openly of the linea sacra, the sacred line, tracing names through coded genealogies disguised as poetry. Northward, in France, the idea took a darker form. The Valois and Bourbon dynasties each claimed divine sanction, but in taverns and monasteries alike, men muttered that true legitimacy might belong to an entirely different family, one protected, perhaps, by exiled Templars. The most chilling stories, however, came from Spain. During the fever of the Reconquista, when Inquisition fires blackened the skies, cryptic reports told of knights who smuggled children across mountain passes, placing them in households where their blood could disappear into peasantry, safe, invisible, yet enduring. One inquisitor wrote bitterly that the seed of heresy survives by flesh, not parchment. His words were meant as condemnation, but centuries later they read like confirmation. By the 1500s, the heresy of the bloodline had become a paradox, too dangerous to speak aloud, too enticing to silence completely. Alchemists disguised it in their treatises, speaking of red gold that must be preserved through vessels of clay. Painters embedded it in brushstrokes, slipping vine and chalice motifs into otherwise orthodox altarpieces. Even in England, where the Tudors tightened their grip, rumors flickered that their crown was not the truest, that a more ancient claim slept in shadow, waiting, and always, behind these currents, loomed the ghost of the Templars. Their suppression in 1307 had been meant to erase. Instead, it gave birth to an idea that they had guarded something too dangerous to fall into papal hands. If treasure could vanish, if archives could vanish, why not heirs? The Vatican did not underestimate this. Agents combed monasteries for errant verses. Records were redacted, entire families pushed into obscurity, but even as they tried to choke the roots, the branches grew, sprawling, entwined with myth, legend, and hope. For the common man, it was a story of possibility. That divinity had once touched human flesh and perhaps still walked among them. For rulers, it was a threat. For secret brotherhoods, it was a purpose. By the dawn of the Reformation, the bloodline heresy was no longer just a rumor. It was a map, a hidden, fragmentary one, carved across Europe in stone symbols, cryptic poems, erased names, and whispered oaths. A map that, to this day, some still claim can be followed. By the 17th century, the whispers of a sacred bloodline had seeped into new containers, secret fraternities that dressed themselves in ritual, geometry, and light. The Rosicrucians were the first to make it loud. Their anonymous manifestos spoke of hidden wisdom passed down through chosen heirs, not just of ideas but of blood. To the uninitiated, it was philosophy wrapped in allegory. To those who read between the lines, it was another way of saying, the line still exists. Freemasonry followed, sprawling across Europe like ivy on stone. Its lodges drew nobles, merchants, and revolutionaries alike. Their symbols, compass, square, eye, were said to encode truths older than Christendom itself. Among the rituals, rumors grew of lost kings, whose descendants sat quietly among them, disguised as ordinary brothers. Some whispered of a hidden sovereign, a king without throne, whose legitimacy was older than any pope or crown. In Paris, salons buzzed with talk of a royal secret buried beneath Notre Dame. In Scotland, Jacobite exiles whispered that their cause was more than political. It was messianic, tied to blood that stretched back to Jerusalem itself. And in Germany, occultists painted diagrams of genealogies hidden in plain sight, weaving together biblical patriarchs, Merovingian kings, and shadowy names only insiders would recognize. The Vatican called them charlatans. Monarchs called them traitors. But the people, especially those restless under taxes, wars, and endless hierarchy, called them something else. Hope. Hope that power might not forever belong to the same dynasties. Hope that one day a hidden king, a bloodline blessed, would rise and reorder the world. But there was another side. These networks also attracted men who saw not salvation, but leverage. To claim kinship with this bloodline was to claim authority beyond law, a power that no crown or mitre could easily crush. Documents were forged, relics manufactured, entire genealogies fabricated. Every forgery added another layer of smoke around the fire, making it harder to tell where truth ended and invention began. And so the heresy of the bloodline survived, not by clarity, but by confusion. By the 18th century, it was everywhere and nowhere, a flicker in Masonic halls, a whisper in alchemical texts, a murmur in court intrigues. No proof, yet no extinction. Like a ghost, it lingered. Like blood itself, it flowed unseen. And some claimed, still claim, that the line never died, only learned to hide better. The 19th century loved to dig, not just in the soil of ancient ruins, but in the bones of history itself. Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt had awakened Europe to the romance of lost empires, and suddenly scholars, priests, and treasure hunters alike turned their eyes toward the sands and stones. Among them were those who whispered again of the Templars, of their vanished wealth, of the bloodlines they might have protected. It was in this atmosphere that the first modern theories of the secret bloodline began to breathe. Writers with one hand in scholarship and the other in myth began weaving connections between Merovingian kings, between strange symbols on medieval churches, between the secrecy of the Vatican archives and the silence that followed any serious inquiry. The word heresy had faded, but curiosity had replaced it. By the mid-1800s, in dusty Parisian cafes and candle-lit lodges of secret societies, men exchanged pamphlets claiming that the descendants of Christ still walked among them. Some even claimed to be those descendants themselves. These were not kings or bishops, but dreamers, often failed nobles or eccentric scholars who craved a lineage that would make sense of their own obscurity. Then came the 20th century, and with it, darker forces. In the ruins of a Europe shattered by war, mysticism found fertile ground. Certain members of the Nazi elite, Himmler most of all, sought to bind their brutal ideology to some imagined sacred bloodline. Expeditions were sent to Tibet, to Cathar strongholds in France, to the Holy Land itself, all in search of relics that could anchor their vision of destiny. To them, history was not just memory. It was a weapon. The idea that a divine lineage had once threaded through kings and crusaders was intoxicating, and they twisted it into fuel for conquest. At the same time, in quieter corners, the Freemasons and Rosicrucians revived their own rituals, some claiming descent from the very Templars who had burned in 1307. For them, bloodline was metaphor, purity of wisdom, continuity of secret knowledge, passed from hand to hand. Yet the imagery of sacred families, hidden heirs, and veiled brides of Christ lingered in their rites. The Vatican, for its part, said little. Its archives grew thicker, its reputation as a locked vault of dangerous documents stronger. Every time a curious historian petitioned to examine certain parchments, say, the trial records of the Templars, or letters sealed by Clement V, the doors closed tighter, and so silence became its own evidence. To the public mind, if the Church hid it, it must be true. Then, in 1982, a book hit like a thunderclap, Holy Blood, Holy Grail. Its authors, Bagent, Lee, and Lincoln, stitched together fragments of medieval genealogy, local legends from southern France, and the shadowy Priory of Sion, claiming that the bloodline of Christ had not vanished but survived, flowing through the veins of European royalty. They did not prove it, but they suggested it with such authority that readers filled in the blanks themselves. The book became a cultural event. Suddenly, the old whispers became mainstream conversation. Documentaries aired late at night, spinning tales of knights carrying secrets across the Pyrenees. Tourist towns like Rennes-le-Château swelled with pilgrims of mystery, not faith. And when the Da Vinci Code arrived in 2003, the idea leapt from fringe into pop culture obsession. Millions believed, or wanted to believe, that under the floors of the Louvre, under the stones of Paris, in the vaults of Rome, the story of a holy bloodline still waited. But with popularity came distortion. Historians dismissed most of the claims as fantasy built on forgery and wishful thinking. The Priory of Sion, for example, turned out to be a 20th century invention by a Frenchman named Pierre Plantard. Yet myths, once told, are not easily untold. The more evidence was debunked, the more believers insisted that debunking itself was proof of suppression. After all, wasn't denial exactly what you'd expect if the truth were dangerous? So by the end of the 20th century, we had entered a strange double world. In universities, the Templar bloodline theory was laughed at, grouped with Atlantis and ancient aliens. In living rooms, however, it was whispered with wine over dinner parties, passed around in paperbacks, written into television scripts. The myth had achieved something more powerful than truth. It had achieved cultural immortality. And today? Walk into a bookstore in London or New York, and you'll still find the section, Knights Templar, Lost Gospels, Vatican Secrets. Google the phrase, sacred bloodline, and you'll descend into endless rabbit holes, half academic, half delirious. The Templars may have been burned, their archives scattered, but their ghost walks more vividly than ever. The question is not whether the bloodline survived. The question is why we need it to. Why, century after century, do we return to the image of hidden heirs, secret unions, veiled brides, children smuggled through deserts and cathedrals? Perhaps because blood makes history feel alive. Perhaps because in a world of shifting empires and fading faith, the idea of a single thread, unbroken, sacred, and human, feels like a miracle we can still reach for. And so, the modern resurgence is not just in books or films. It is in us, the listeners, the readers, the ones who keep asking, what if? In the age of satellites and smartphones, You'd think mystery would have no shadows left to hide in. Everything is mapped, scanned, archived, and uploaded. The Vatican's corridors have been photographed, the Dead Sea Scrolls digitized, and genealogical databases can track your ancestry back 10 generations with a cheek swab. And yet, whispers of the sacred bloodline remain. Why? Because technology doesn't kill myths, it feeds them. In the early 2000s, when home DNA kits first entered the market, a quiet movement began online. People searching not just for Irish roots or Viking ancestors, but for something greater. Forums appeared with names like Children of Magdalene or Sangreal Descendants. Posters claimed to share unusual haplogroups, connecting themselves, sometimes seriously, sometimes desperately, to that ancient thread of holy lineage. A swab of saliva became, in their eyes, a sacrament. At the same time, the Vatican doubled down on silence. Each time a new document leaked, a supposed fragment of a lost gospel, a medieval chart of Merovingian heirs, the Church released careful denials, but opened no doors. And the secrecy only deepened fascination. On YouTube, conspiracy channels grew into empires. In dim-lit basements, hobbyists drew family trees that stretched from the deserts of Judea to the palaces of Europe. Some even convinced themselves they bore the mark, a faint cross-shaped birthmark, a strange dream of deserts, a family story passed down in whispers. Hollywood, too, kept the fire burning. After the Da Vinci Code, countless imitators followed. Films, TV shows, novels, all reimagined the bloodline as thriller, romance, horror. The sacred descendants became hunted fugitives, secret monarchs, reluctant prophets, and though critics scoffed, audiences returned again and again. Because beneath the fiction lay a hunger, a need to believe that history wasn't just dates and battles, but a story still alive, still flowing in veins. But here is the strange twist. In the real corridors of power, the myth began to matter. A handful of political movements in Europe quietly invoked heritage with a nod to old bloodline theories, suggesting that their cause was blessed by ancestry. Wealthy families funded foundations that researched sacred descent. Even in America, where democracy was meant to sever the rule of lineage, whispers crept in. What if certain dynasties were more than just political? What if their power wasn't just money, but something older, something sanctified? And so, the bloodline became less about faith and more about identity. In an age where institutions crumble and truths blur, claiming descent from the divine is not just myth, it's armor. It's a way of saying, I matter because I am part of a story that began at the dawn of belief. But here is the haunting question. What if belief itself can create the bloodline? What if the centuries of stories, pilgrimages, and whispered genealogies have birthed something more enduring than DNA? A myth so strong that it reshapes reality, persuading generations to live as though it were true. In a sense, the bloodline does exist, woven not in chromosomes, but in culture, in art, in the hunger of millions who choose to carry it forward. You can see it in Rennes-le-Château, where tourists still leave flowers by the ruined church. You can see it in encrypted online groups, where strangers share dreams of Magdalene and code them as prophecies. You can even see it in quiet moments, when someone stands in a cathedral, hears the echo of centuries in stone, and whispers, maybe they were here, maybe I am one of them. And if that seems foolish, remember this. All nations are built on bloodlines. Kings traced theirs back to gods. Americans speak of founding fathers as if they were saints. Families guard coats of arms, not because the ink matters, but because the story does. Myth is the marrow of history, and the sacred bloodline, whether fact or fiction, has become one of the strongest myths of all. So where does that leave us now? Not with proof, not with certainty, but with a choice. We can dismiss it as fantasy, or we can treat it as a mirror, reflecting our deepest need to belong to something larger, something that survives time, death, and empire. Maybe the real bloodline isn't about who carried the child of Christ, or whether a secret family escaped persecution. Maybe the real bloodline is belief itself. The endless chain of voices from 1307 to now who refuse to let the story die. And tonight, as you sit here, perhaps in Boston, or London, or Toronto, listening to this tale, you've become part of it, because each listener, each whisper, each retelling adds another link to the chain. You are the bloodline now. Some say the story ends in archives, dusty scrolls locked in Vatican vaults guarded by silence and ceremony. Others believe the story ends in DNA tests and forgotten cemeteries, where names have been weathered smooth by centuries of rain. But there's another way to see it. Perhaps the story of the sacred bloodline was never meant to end at all, because endings are a comfort of modern minds. History rarely gives them. The last time the Templars rode together on that October dawn in 1307, they believed they were sealing their order against betrayal. They trusted parchment, seals, signatures, oaths. But fire scattered them. Betrayal carried them across seas, into secret halls, into myths that could not be burned. What was destroyed in daylight survived in whispers. Whispers are not fragile. They grow. And so the bloodline, whether of Magdalene, of Merovingians, or of some forgotten branch, survives not in proof, but in persistence. It survives because people keep asking. It survives because human beings cannot stand the thought that the divine touched earth once, and then left nothing behind. There are rumors, of course, of a last seal, a chest hidden beneath the stones of some ruined priory, a scroll marked with symbols no one has yet deciphered, a blood-red wax stamp pressed by hands long turned to dust. Researchers have claimed to glimpse fragments, half-erased diagrams, lines of Latin in forgotten libraries. Each time the claim surfaces, the Vatican remains silent. Each time, silence deepens the echo. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Even if the last seal were found, would it matter? A document can be faked. DNA can be doubted. A tomb can be misattributed. In the end, what survives is not evidence but hunger. Hunger for a story that bridges heaven and earth, flesh and spirit. And that hunger has already carved itself into the world. You can see it in cathedrals built with impossible devotion, in secret societies that still gather under moonlight, in novels that ignite imaginations, and in online groups trading family trees like relics. The last seal is not buried in stone. It is sealed inside us. Maybe that's why the Vatican doesn't speak. Maybe silence is not suppression, but recognition, that some stories grow stronger when left unfinished. That mystery feeds faith in ways certainty never could. So tonight, as you sit in your quiet room, the glow of a screen lighting your face, you've been walking through the same corridors that knights, priests, and heretics once did. You've followed a trail of whispers across centuries, and whether you believe in the bloodline or not, you've felt it, that pull towards something older, stranger, and more enduring than kings and empires. Maybe you'll close this video and move on, laughing at the idea. Or maybe, when the lights go out, you'll wonder, what if? What if the child existed? What if the line continued? What if one of your neighbors, your classmates, or even you carry a drop of that story in your veins? Wouldn't that change everything? And here we leave it, not with a seal broken, not with proof delivered, but with the same silence that has carried this myth across ages. A silence heavy enough to bend the course of history. So tell me, do you think the story ends here? Or does it keep living in you, in me, in every voice that refuses to let it die? If you've walked with me through these shadows, I'd ask you, don't let the trail stop. Subscribe, share, and keep the story alive, because myths survive on breath, and every retelling is another heartbeat for the bloodline. And as the tide of history rolls forward, as empires fall and screens flicker, The whispers remain, waiting. Perhaps the last seal is not meant to be broken. Perhaps the last seal is us.